Hello, good afternoon. Today our guest is Dr. Eric Schansberg. Hello, Eric. How are you doing?
Doing well.
So, Dr. Schansberg is a politician. He will be running to represent the Ninth District in Indiana. Dr. Schansberg, what is motivating your decision to run?
Well, first is opportunity. There's many times I might consider running, but this is an open seat. And so it's an opportunity. It's also a GOP dominated district and a GOP dominating year, it looks like. So it's all about the primary and it's an open seat. I mean, beating an incumbent is really difficult. But I think on the supply side, there's just a lot of issues going on. The economy's a mess. You've got debt in particular. We know that we're driving towards a cliff at a high rate. We know the foot's on the accelerator. We don't know where the cliff's at, but we know we can't sustain this.
All right.
And inflation, and there's a range of micro issues, but there's a bunch of economic issues that are really troubling.
And what's the name of the present representative?
Yeah, his name is Trey Hollingsworth, and it's the 9th district in Indiana. Another big issue for me is federalism, right? That's the idea that we should, whatever one thinks about government being involved, there's still the question of federal, state, and local. And so even if people think, they want the government involved, that doesn't mean the federal government should be involved. So for example, your listeners may know that their kids have been on school buses with masks, but that's not local government deciding that. That was the federal government mandating that. Why is the federal government mandating masks? Even if masks are a good idea, even if you're a fan of mandates of masks, that's not a federal government decision. Or election law, right? Why is that being decided by the federal government? Let states run their own elections. So that's the question of federalism. And the last big consideration is that I want to be a compelling and civil voice in DC. We've had a lot of terrible rhetoric, people pursuing power for its own end. And we got to do better than that. Everything is interpreted through a highly political lens, very divisive. And we need to talk about policy, need to talk about it in a civil and compelling way. I want to go up there and be not just a vote, but a voice on these issues.
Eric, politicians like to talk about policy when they're interested in winning, but upon gaining office, many of them tend to forget policy and instead opt to become an instrument for business lobbyist or trade unionist or some other group. Will you be different?
Well, I'm different in that I'm a policy analyst. I'm a free market economist. So I've thought, taught, and written about public policy for 30 years. My first book on public policy was in 1996 called Poor Policy, How Government Harms the Poor. Second policy book, 2003, Turn Neither to the Right nor to the Left, a Christian's guide, a thinking Christian's guide to politics and public policy. So putting my faith together with my vocation, this is just crucial. Some of the seem like very nice people, reasonably principled, but they just haven't spent the time that I have on public policy in terms of knowledge, in terms of a framework, a philosophy of what is government, what should government do. And so if you don't go to DC with a lot of principle and a lot of knowledge, then I think that's how you end up. You're going to be buffeted by the winds of change, the winds of politics. You're going to be, persuaded by arguments that sound good but really aren't. And so I think it's important to send people to DC that understand public policy, have a framework for understanding government, what it does, how it really works, not just how we imagine it's going to work, and how markets work as well. I mean, people undersell the beauty and the power of economic markets as well.
Eric, I am a libertarian, and I'm one of those who argue that populism is not ideological. One can be a right-leaning populist or a left-leaning populist. Populist policies ought to benefit average people. So protectionism, for instance, protectionism is a form of economic nationalism, and on average, protectionism is expensive. Presently in the Republican Party, some support protectionism. Donald Trump was a big economic nationalist, and you are running to represent the people of Indiana and across America, especially in Republican circles, we're experiencing a resurgence of protectionism. And obviously, as a libertarian, you don't support protectionist policies. So, how do you plan to explain to your base that anti-protectionist policies are actually good?
Yeah. So Democrats also, of course, have become more protectionist as well. And on populism, I think you make a great point. My last academic journal article actually last year was in the Cato Journal, and it's called The Limits of Democracy. And I talk at length about populism. So I think that's a really nice readable resource. A lot of journal articles are difficult to read, but I think people would enjoy reading that one. It's The Limits of Democracy and Cato. I think you have to use broad examples about, or broad considerations about the ethics of trade restrictions. I'm a libertarian in terms of political ideology. So I think you have to make the argument both in ethical and practical terms. Why is it okay for us to restrict trade? And it's hard to make that argument. And then practically it causes all this other damage to an economy. The last phone call I had actually before the interview was with someone who's been harmed by prescription prices. And a lot of that is trade restrictions. And so I think we have to make the case in broad terms, conceptually, and then we have to have specific examples where trade restrictions cause a lot of damage. For example, steel import quotas cause trouble for GE and Ford. Prescription restrictions are harmful to people that need to get lower price medicine. So I think that's the best way to make the case, but it's always difficult. You have concentrated benefits, you have diffuse costs, and concentrated benefits, are more obvious to people. So it is a difficult case to make, but we have to make that case because protectionism causes a lot of damage.
Let me read this important article from 2020, published by NCB News, titled Trump Steel Tariffs Raise Prices, Shriveled Up Demand Led to Job Losses, some Michigan workers say. Lydia Cox, she's an economist. She was cited, and according to Lydia, the policy did not trickle down to average workers, and hundreds of thousands of jobs were lost.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, we know that's how it works. It's just getting people to understand the diffuse costs, the secondary logic and reasoning of the damage that trade restrictions occur. One of the logic pieces I like to use stories is, we're doing sanctions against Russia. In other words, we're restricting trade with them to harm them. In other words, and we're willing to bear costs ourselves to do that. We're going to pay higher prices in gasoline so that we can harm Russia. Well, that's exactly what trade restrictions do. Trade restrictions are like self-imposed sanctions where we do harm to our consumers in order to do some harm to other people. And just doesn't make sense. It's not good for your country to impose a blockade on yourself, to impose sanctions on yourself, to discriminate against others by nationality. And there's some conceptual models that economists use that are very powerful for this. We know sanctions and boycotts harm other people. Why would we impose them on ourselves?
Brilliant point. We're also going to talk about manufacturing. Dr. Schansberg, manufacturing is similar to agriculture. When countries attain a higher level of economic development, some sectors like manufacturing and agriculture often decline. Is the decline in manufacturing bad?
I haven't looked at the numbers in a while, but my understanding of it is that our manufacturing productivity has not declined. It's that manufacturing jobs as a percentage of total jobs has declined. And if that's the case, that's an important distinction to make. It's certainly the case that the decline in the labor force is more than the decline in productivity. So I think that's a point that needs to be made. But yes, you're right. I mean, economies have an evolution from agriculture to manufacturing towards services. And it's actually a complicated topic. I don't want to get into a lot of that. Even what does it mean to have service jobs or manufacturing jobs? One of the favorite points I like to make with students is that when we hear these kind of comparisons, it's always the best of the manufacturing jobs, which are compared to the worst of the service jobs. And I tell my students, look, if someone's trying to tell you the best of one category and comparing it to the worst of another category, they're trying to yank your chain, right? So that's just not an appropriate comparison. Someone's trying to work out a political agenda that favors manufacturing. Again, we're back to the topic of protectionism, and get us in the mood to have higher prices of things using the leverage of government to do net harm to an economy and to benefit an interest group at the expense of the general public.
I like your answer, Eric. Manufacturing workers in America are productive. Yes, I have read the data. Based on output, America has the most productive manufacturing workers. Manufacturing is declining, but efficiency is increasing, and people are actually relocating to better jobs.
The same thing happened in agriculture, right? I mean, it used to be most of us were farmers, and then what happens? You have these technological advances. If you look at what man hours do with respect to productivity in agriculture, it's freakish. It's 100, 200 fold what it was a century ago. And we don't eat 200 times as much food as we did back in the day. So what's that mean? We don't need as many farmers. So we've had this slow evolution over time in farming. And we just, there's been some adjustment there, but we've kind of, we've grown accustomed to that. We're producing as more food than ever, but we don't need as many people to do it. And the same thing's happening in manufacturing.
It's really about the benefits of efficiency. Mm-hmm. When countries become more efficient, people work less, but we get more.
Yeah. And there may still be something to say politically about, the troubles of competition for those that are being competed with. I mean, we shouldn't ignore that, but we also shouldn't ignore the costs of the proposed remedies, right? We should go into it with both eyes open and looking at the benefits and the costs of those policies at a practical level. And that's just typically not done. We're sold a bill of goods, about one half of the equation, while the rest of the equation is ignored.
Eric, what are your thoughts relating to immigration?
So a couple of distinctions here, right? First, illegal immigration and legal immigration. Illegal immigration, I would say we ought to do the best we can to have a border. It's very simplistic to say we're just going to throw up a wall and build a wall. Well, that doesn't make any sense. It's not cost effective. If you're a fan of the wall, really what you're looking at is a combination of physical barriers and technology that would be effective for watching the border. I'm a big fan of legal immigration. If people want to come to America and be productive and work and be good citizens and all that, the more the merrier, right? So immigration of productive citizens, not to come here and get on welfare or something and engage in redistribution, but if they're coming here to engage in mutually beneficial trade and be involved in our communities, and that's a beautiful thing. And the last thing I would say is that our process of legal immigration is arbitrary and capricious. I mean, it's when you talk to people that have been in it, you'll hear everything from it wasn't too bad to it's terrible. I had to try this and hire a lawyer for that. And if you have a process of legal immigration that is terribly burdensome and arbitrary and lengthy, you're begging people to come here illegally. So our legal process should be as unencumbered as possible.
Fair point. Eric, what do you think about sanctuary cities?
At the federal level, I'm not a fan of the federal government collecting money from cities and states and then giving it back to cities. So as a federal matter, I wouldn't give federal funds to any city, right? I don't know why we're in the business of that. Other than that, it's a local and state matter, I think, for the most part. And so I would say, we enforce our borders, we do what we can with respect to that. I guess you're talking about sanctuary with respect to immigration, is
yes,
that right?
Especially with respect to immigration and people who commit crimes.
Yeah. Well, committing crimes, that's a different matter, right? So that would be...
But they're protected. They're still protected if they're residing in a sanctuary city.
Yeah, cities and states need to take care of that. The federal government needs to take care of the border. That's what it's in charge of. Beyond that, I don't see the federal government. I don't see the the net benefit of the federal government trying to get involved in that. That should be left to cities and states.
Eric, Donald Trump is depicted as an interesting character by some. And you are one of the first academics to write an intellectual piece defending Trumpism. Do you remember that piece?
I might have defended parts of Trumpism, yes.
Comment on Trumpism. What
Okay.
is Trumpism and what are your views?
Yeah, well, he's obviously a very complicated and interesting character. That's one of the interesting things about this race, right? I mean, among the Republicans, there is this split between people who are, worship the guy and people who despise him. So there's quite a bit of that in the party. I mean, starting with policy, I would say he was a very mixed bag in policy terms, probably the best president we've had since Clinton, which doesn't say much. But he had, for example, 2 large tax decreases, cut the tax rate, reduced income taxes, big tax simplification policy. Very few people talk about that, but that's a wonderful move that was led by President Trump. But he also had 2 huge tax increases that no one wants to talk about, especially Republicans. First of all, the trade restrictions, right? Those are very large tax increases. And then, of course, all the debt and spending. So from Bush, second Bush, all the way through Trump, the Republicans, unfortunately, have not been much better than Democrats on spending and debt. And, if the Republicans aren't going to speak for fiscal conservatism, that's a big part of why we have problems today. I expect the GOP to carry the pail of water on that, and they haven't. Trump was terrible at that. So, when you run $1 trillion deficit, that's tax. Because somebody else is going to pay that in the future. And worse than that, back to democracy and populism, it's the worst kind of tax because you're imposing a burden on people who've had no say in the matter. It's people in the future who didn't vote for all that spending, and you're going to make them pay the bill. So there's an ethical problem with this. There's a practical problem. And so, Trump was a very mixed bag on economics. The trade stuff was terrible. Foreign policy, not too bad, I think. I mean, not ideal, but again, maybe the best we've had going back, I don't know, quite a while. So, I think a mixed bag in terms of policy, but, just the rhetoric, the divisiveness, the decorum, it's just not appropriate for a president. And so, it's interesting. You've got generally rural conservative voters who are like, go Donald. And then you have your more suburban voters who found him somewhere between embarrassing and repulsive. So that's really gross generalization, but that's the state of, I think, the Republican Party at this point, trying to match those. But, I guess in a nutshell, modest policy, mediocre, mixed bag, got stuff done. Got to give him credit for that. But the style stuff is just unacceptable.
That's the problem with Donald Trump. On the policy front, he was not necessarily a disaster. The Heartland Institute and other serious pro-market environmental think tanks praised Donald Trump. And in the arena of foreign policy, Trump did not and had no interest to entangle America in useless wars. However, he's not an intellectual. I don't have a problem with a president not being an intellectual, but if you're going to be the president of the United States, this will require a certain level of level-headedness, and Trump is not level-headed. Yeah. So when people say Trumpism, it's a bit infuriating because this is someone who likes to win. He's a reality TV show host, but he's not really serious. So on one level, he was restricting immigration, and on another level, he was pro-market or claimed to be pro-market. Donald Trump told us that he was going to clear the swamp, but farm subsidies are still a big problem. Government bureaucracy is still a big problem. And during the latter part of his administration, he promoted policies to assist African Americans, but for the most part, these policies were statist policies that required government support. So it's a bit confusing.
Yeah. Well, I'm trained in public choice economics. I went to George Mason for my undergrad, and one of the founding, principles and concepts in public choice is rational ignorance and apathy, that voters are just not incentivized to be knowledgeable about anything much and to care. And I give my students lots of free knowledge about politics and they still don't do anything, right? So it's not just ignorance, but it's apathy, but it's all rational. And so when I talk to, average voters, 99.9% of people, they're not incentivized to study policy like I am. And so, whether it's, Biden or Trump or Obama, voters pick an issue or two. They like style considerations, right? They like Trump style, they like Obama style. That's how voters work. And that's really to be expected. They're busy mowing their lawns, raising their kids. They're not going to spend a lot of time thinking about policy. And to be frank, I'm thankful we live in a country where we don't have to spend that much time thinking about government. It's a wonderful thing. But the flip side of that is that voters just generally don't know what's going on. And so it's kind of frustrating, like I'm a politician calling people right now and wow, there's a great opportunity for them to talk, just even hear my spiel for 30 seconds or talk with me for a few minutes, some really effective, low cost information, and they're not interested. So voters just have so little information. What's that mean? Well, they're going to vote on things like his style or Obama's style, or he's pro-life, or he says he's Second Amendment, or he says blank. And that's what a lot of voters rely on. And it's not to be expected. So I wish, utopian, I wish voters knew a whole lot more, but it's ridiculous for me to expect that. They're just not incentivized to make those sort of investments.
Politics is about style, Eric. I don't care much for style. I'm more of a substance guy, but most people are interested in style. Eric, is your style appealing to the average voter?
Well, I don't know. I am I'm a wonderful person. I don't know. I mean, I'm serious. I'm funny. I'm knowledgeable. I'm not sure what voters think about all this. One of the lines I have is, I'm strong in the Constitution. I'm pro-life, and I'm a longtime economics professor. And then my laugh line is to say, well, we could probably use a little more of that in DC these days. And I think about 2/3 of the people don't get the joke, but the other third laugh. And then my next line is to say, yeah, but it's really not that funny, is it? And so I'm not sure what people think or how they vote. Do they respond to a blizzard of mailers? Do they respond to a personal touch? We're calling somebody, is it word of mouth, grassroots? I mean, we really don't know what voters respond to on average or any given case. So, you just do what you can, you work hard, you put your time and other resources into it, and you see what happens.
But Eric, as I said earlier, on the policy front, I don't have a big objection to Donald Trump. He's not my style, but presently in the Republican Party, Trump is still popular. So do you plan to court Trumpists?
Well, not really. I mean, I plan to court every voter I can, right? So, but if someone's loves Trump policies, or they only pay attention to one policy, and I'm not on board with that, or they love his style, they want someone who's going to, throw bombs. That's not me, and I just don't think that's good for the country. So, some of those voters I'm just not going to get. I don't have the style that will appeal to them, but I can't be that. That's not me. I don't think that's in the best interest of the country, where we're claiming every election is stolen. Hillary claimed the election was stolen in 2016. Trump does the same thing. We can't live in a country where people are constantly questioning elections. We can't live in a country where it's all about attacking other people. It doesn't work. And so I just don't think that's good for the country. So if that loses me votes, that's the way it's got to be. I can't be that.
So you're not willing to dilute the substance of Eric Schansberg to appease voters. Not a problem. You're a tough guy. Americans like politicians with integrity, and they also appreciate forceful individuals. So I don't have a problem with you not kowtowing to Trump, but at the same time, knowing the electorate at the present moment, if you want to win, you need to have some force, be really
Yeah,
aggressive.
I agree. And here's
Aggression
one.
sells. I don't like it, but it is selling.
Yeah, so I think you have to be forceful. I mean, there is a tension between compelling, civil, and forceful. I'm not going to be milk toast and bland. I mean, I'm passionate about these issues, so I think that's one consideration. What was the other thing I was thinking of? Oh, I think another thing where I am Trumpian is that I'm independent. So, when a lot of my opponents, I don't know. I mean, they're probably maybe they'll be fiercely independent, but I don't have any reason to really see that other than maybe one or two of my opponents having any kind of record or disposition for that. But I'm not going to be a good Republican. I'm not going to go up there and be a good soldier for the leadership. If they want votes that I find, disturbing, repulsive, whatever, I'm just not going to join them. And so if that means I get lesser committee assignments or whatever, fine. So I think that part of it, me and maybe one other candidate are more Trumpian than the rest because we're going to be willing to stand against the party. And whereas many candidates won't. I'm not going there to be a reliable Republican vote. That is not my life's too short, life's too long to behave like that in my mind. That's not why I'm going to DC, and that's very Trumpian. I want to shake things up. I want to do the right thing. I'm not going to toe the party line, those sorts of things.
Eric, as a future politician, you will have legislative powers. What's on your legislative agenda?
In terms of introducing legislation or coming up with newer ideas, one fairly serious idea would be tax reform. One of the issues I talk about a lot that doesn't, I can't believe it doesn't get enough attention are FICA or payroll taxes. Economists will tell you that the burden of a tax depends on the relevant elasticities. And because of the elasticities, FICA is actually borne almost completely by workers. And so that ends up being about a 15% tax on every dollar earned by the working poor and middle class. And so if you earn $70,000 a year, that's $10,000 a year in FICA taxes. If you're at the poverty line, that's $3,000 a year the federal government takes from people at the poverty line. And that's just not good enough. That is terrible. And then it finances Social Security with its 0% rate of return. So there's just all kinds of problems with that. So I'd like to make some inroads on FICA. I just think it's a devastating policy at the federal level. So that's a big one. I think I'd also have some fun with some innovative ideas. If the Democrats want to push a $15 minimum wage, for example, I think I would sponsor a $25 minimum wage and call it the make it more expensive to hire less skilled workers Compassion Act of 2023, something like that. I just think people are sometimes we're ridiculous in our pursuits, and if we name the ridiculousness, I'm hoping something like that will help tilt the debate and tilt the discussion on these things. So I think, just again, going up there, doing something different, talking about some different issues can be helpful. And of course, you have to fit into the dinner conversation too. I can't just be up there talking about what I want to talk about. So there are other issues, the debt. I would advocate freezing spending until we get the deficits, taken care of. Something like that would be very basic, but there's a lot of things that I would get my hands into.
Eric, I'm big on entrepreneurship. What are your plans to cultivate high growth firms? People often talk about small businesses, but 80% of small businesses fail according to one study. And some of the businesses that remain, they become the gazelles, the high growth firms. They really do well. On average, small businesses are actually expensive for the economy. On high rates of entrepreneurship are actually associated with economic sluggishness. So as someone who's serious and an individual who appreciates the long-term picture, how do you plan to enable high growth small businesses?
Well, again, you got to distinguish between state, local, and federal. So I think a lot of that action occurs at the state government level, and I think it's important to make that distinction. The federal government, I think the main thing is regulation, and so deregulatory efforts, regulations are a fixed cost, they're overhead. They make it difficult for all small businesses. They inherently tilt the field towards big business, and they make it more difficult on entrepreneurs. So I think at the federal level, a lot of it would be trying to keep regulation at bay, sunsetting regulations, finding small examples and kind of big reform institutional changes that would lessen the role of regulation that hampers entrepreneurship. And one example of that, not entrepreneurship exactly, but you've got the Dodd-Frank Act, you've got the Affordable Care Act, both of the, and HIPAA, regulations like that. And whatever you think of the merits of those bills, it's unassailable that both of them increase the regulatory burden tremendously on banks and on healthcare entities. And the economists would predict, well, you increase your overhead costs, your fixed costs, your regulatory costs, you're going to get market concentration. And that's what we've seen the last 10 to 15 years in healthcare and banking, a consolidation and greater market concentration. That's inevitable. If you want small companies, you've got to keep the fixed costs low. You've got to avoid regulatory burdens that tilt the field towards larger businesses and incumbent businesses. And so regulation, I think, is my top answer to that.
I agree with you 100%. There are regulations making it difficult for people to work from home. The regulations that stifle the entrepreneurial potential of young children. So I do agree with you 100%. Eric, recently, many, especially in the Republican Party, have been proposing solutions to regulate big tech. Do you have an opinion on big tech? And should it be regulated? Based on the data and many studies that I have been reading, and economists, what they have been saying is that companies like Amazon don't constitute critical infrastructure, and the arguments in favor of regulating big tech are overstated. But to the average person, big tech should be regulated. What are your views?
A lot of interesting things to say here. I mean, one of them is that it's interesting that usually antitrust is brought in with a concern about really high prices. And that's not the case here. The price of these things is typically zero. So that's at least interesting and odd. It doesn't prove anything, but it's at least worth noting that it's not a concern about high prices, which is always, I think, or is usually the case with antitrust. I think the lens I would put this through is what I always do, right? Is it ethical? Is it practical? You can make an okay ethical argument for using government to bust up natural monopoly power. My concerns are more on the practical side. Is it really going to work? And how's it going to work compared to market forces? And so, I just am not optimistic about government generally. There's a high opportunity cost to these sorts of pursuits. You've got lots of smart people spending lots of resources for our country to try and deal with these things. You worry about capture of the regulatory body. So I just am not confident. I could study it some more. It's not an area of great expertise, but I'm not confident that government would, improve things enough to make it worth it.
But these are pressing issues, and if you get national spotlight, you're going to be posed with these questions. So have you been interviewed by Tucker Carlson as yet?
No. Yeah, I don't think in the primary I would. If I win the primary, then almost certainly win the district in November. So I don't know if Tucker would be all that interested in me until I get there. And then, if I can make a splash and be a voice on these issues, then hopefully I'd have a chance to use places like that to get those views out. But I doubt I'd be talking to Tucker until 2023.
How are you looking in the polls?
I have no idea. I'm a second tier candidate, I think, at this point. As far as I know, there are two candidates that have more name exposure and more money than I do. So the strength of my campaign will depend largely on grassroots. We're spending money, but we are not going to, match the big money folks that are out there. But I've been teaching in this area for 30 years. I've got students all over the district, active in ministry and church and community. So I've got lots of people who are, big fans. I mean, in fact, that's the reason I got in. I had a lot of people say stuff like, we need people like you in DC. And as I was thinking about running, I agree with that. And if I don't have a good reason not to run, then I need to get in there and give it a shot. So that's what we're doing. And so, if there's a lot of people who are big fans of me and they talk to other people and are persuasive, I don't know how extensive grassroots movements go or how those spread exactly, but if that works, I've got a good shot. But it's early. I mean, we're still working that. I'm still contacting. I haven't gotten to all my students yet, et cetera. But if it can spread, I've got a very good chance.
So, Eric, what's your social media profile like?
In terms of what? I have Facebook and
Are
got
you
a nice
popular on
website.
Twitter? Are you popular on Twitter?
No, and that's not really relevant for this race because a lot of the likely GOP voters in an off-year primary are older. So there's not going to, I mean, voters are older anyway, but in an off-year primary, it turns out they're much older. I've got a lot of people who still have only landlines. And we're in the middle of calling those people. I am in the middle of calling those people. So it's remarkable, I think, for average people to consider, people in that state of life. But yeah, Twitter and those sorts of things is not a major factor in this primary. So, I need to have I have a very good website at ericforcongress.org. We have a Facebook presence. It's relatively low tech. I mean, we'll hit cell phones. We'll do Facebook, YouTube ads, some things like that. But in terms of activity on social media, it's actually surprisingly low.
Well, Eric, politicians are like journalists. They make the news. So maybe, Eric, you should act like you're running for the presidency. Go on Twitter and cannibalize the space.
Yeah, you have to. Yeah, I mean, it's a good idea. You have to have people that watch it. I just, these 70-year-olds aren't on Twitter very much. So
I get your point. You're doing the groundwork,
Yeah.
but a national profile is also crucial.
Yeah.
Even if you lose, when one gets a national profile, it's basically a national hero, a celebrity, and you will always have millions of people following you. And with effective followership, you can become a better leader. Remember, you don't need to enter politics to lead.
Right. No, that's a good point. I mean, to expand the platform, I ran for Congress back in 06 and 08 as a libertarian, and it gave me a nice platform. It expanded my current ability to talk. It changes the circles you run in. You meet different people. And so this campaign certainly has had that as well. I mean, the best part of this is getting a chance to talk with people and influencers like yourself and others and try to move the dialogue further, because we need people in there talking about policy and style and what are we going to do going forward, and what's happening in DC right now is just unacceptable.
I agree that it's unacceptable, but my show is really targeting academics like yourself and business people. I do believe that I have a serious following, but if you want a larger following, again, you get a national profile and you show up on a show like the Shapiro show or the Rubin show. Remember, I'm more of a substance than a hype guy, but people like the hype. And that's what I'm trying to drill into your head. Because if you have been paying attention to the conversation, you recognize that my questions are based on policy, but most people don't want to hear about policy. They don't want a politician to say, I'm going to implement A and B policies so that your pockets can grow. That's not what they want to hear. They want you to go on the poll and say, I don't like AOC.
Yep, I understand. Yeah, we have 7.5 weeks in this primary, so it's going to be over in a split. And so we're just trying to do what we can to get the message out. And if I'm, fortunate to be chosen in May, then I'll probably have a chance to go to DC, and then we'll do the national thing for sure. And because if I'm just a vote in DC, that's not enough. I mean, if that's what it comes to, I'll have to live with that. But I'm not going to be content with that. I want to be a voice, and if that includes being on, Tucker and David and Shapiro and all that, that's great. I mean, I want to get the ideas out. I want people talking about FICA and how terrible Social Security is, particularly for African Americans. And there's a bunch of stuff to talk about that ought to be out there. And so, yes, if I am in DC, I'm absolutely going to do what I can to have a national audience to try to move the debate on these things. We cannot have debt like this. We need to quit doing things that fuel inflation with fiscal and monetary policy. Regulations cause damage. Those are, messages that I will take to the airwaves as much as possible if I'm elected.
Eric, I care about savings and pensions. The IRA, so Peter Thiel is a billionaire, and because he made wise investments, his IRA account is like over 5 billion. And politicians, instead of going to the public to say, more of you can be like Peter Thiel, and even if you're not a billionaire, you can earn 200,000, 1 million, etc. Politicians went to the House to create policies to make it harder for ambitious people to get rich. What's your take on that? I'm annoyed.
Well, yeah, again, back to FICA and Social Security. I mean, we take 15% of every dollar you earn for 40 years. We put it in a shoebox, basically, and then dribble it back to you at a 0% rate of return. People complain about Social Security benefits, but the root issue is that there's no rate of return. They're taking plenty of money from taxpayers. And so I look at that and go, well, that's really annoying to me as an individual upper middle class investor, but I've got a nice nest egg because of other savings and IRAs that I've done. But if you're working poor middle class, that is your nest egg. The government is giving you a garbage nest egg. That should be talked about all the time. Democrats would claim, I ripped Republicans earlier for not being fiscal conservatives. Democrats are supposed to be for free speech. What happened to that? Democrats are supposed to be anti-war. What happened to that? Democrats are supposed to care about the working poor and middle class. What happened to that? If you don't talk about FICA and Social Security, you don't care about the middle class. Those are terrible policies, cause tons of damage all across. I mean, for decades of your life, that causes tons of damage, and it makes retirement needlessly painful for so many people. It takes investment away from people, puts it in the hands of government, and just causes untold damage. So we've got to talk about that.
Exactly. Eric, should pension contributions even be limited? Is this the government's business?
Pension contributions, I mean, pensions are increasingly obsolete in the private sector, so I'm not sure what you're talking about.
No, so I'm talking about pension plans, and this is not unique to the United States. It's in several countries, even in Jamaica, where public sector, where some workers cannot have more than one pension plan. Is this a policy that you support?
No, I mean, if you've had an arrangement with a company and multiple companies have multiple pensions, that's fine. Are you talking about IRA limitations? Or
yes, IRA limitations and government pension limitations. As I said, it's not unique to America.
Yeah, no, there should not be limitations on mutually beneficial trade of that sort. That doesn't make any sense. Now, in terms of tax breaks, for, you can make an argument for limiting the tax breaks on retirement, contributions, but to me, the far larger issue is what we do with Social Security. I mean, I'd put much more energy into that than, worrying about increasing the cap on IRAs or something. That's a second tier issue for me.
Well, I get your point. It's a second tier issue for you, but as a libertarian, the government is not entitled to my money, and it should not be in a position to determine how my resources are being expended. If I want to put 10 million in an IRA account, that is my business. And secondly, I oppose taxing inheritance and pensions. My money belongs to me. I worked for it.
Yeah, if it's already been taxed, what we tax it again for? It doesn't make any sense.
Exactly my point. It's why are you taxing pension investments?
Mm-hmm.
I'm about creating wealth, as I've said frequently. Two types of people like the government: bandits and helpless people.
Yeah, that's right.
Yes,
yeah.
and I am neither.
And unfortunately, there's a lot of rationally ignorant people who like it too, right? They just don't spend any time thinking about it. They're attracted to the style of the latest politician, and they, end up liking big government too, without thinking about it very hard.
So, Eric, speaking to you has been a pleasure. I'm going to share this video. You should too. And remember, energize the campaign and go on social media so I can say this show put a libertarian in the house.
Well, yeah. Website's ericforcongress.org. Financial contributions are helpful. If you know anyone in Southern Indiana who is in the district, we run from Jeffersonville to Bloomington over to Lawrenceburg and Greenburg. It's a triangle basically coming out of Louisville, Kentucky into Indiana. But if you know people, spread the word, and love to have support. Anything you give goes right into advertising. And yes, I think I'm a principled free market economist. And man, we sure need more of that in DC these days.
All right, bye.
Take care, Lipton.